Today, we write the history of tomorrow. Historic decisions only become historic if they are followed by action.
Underneath the perfect storm, there is a place that I just want to go. I'm coming home. The color of your smile will bring the sun, and it will shine, it won't be cold. I'm coming home. In my heart, I'm holding your hand. Walk down these
where work feels like home. Swedbank.
Coming home.
So, dear guests, please sit down, everybody. We are ready to start here. As soon as you shut up, we will start talking. You're already talking at the time which otherwise you could spend hearing our panelists. So thank you all. Thank you for being so numerous. Welcome to the final session of the Lennart Meri conference of this year. It is entitled A Time to Build, Principles for a New Security Architecture. The title, of course, is inspired by Ecclesiastes and says, a time to tear down and a time to build. I'm not sure we have teared down anything, but maybe we had got a little bit threadbare in our security architecture. And unfortunate circumstances have demonstrated to us and made us to recognize and realize where we stand exactly. And hence we now need to scramble to radically shift ourselves into different gear. And this panel is full of people who can discuss varied aspects of getting ready for the next decade, I would say, because the visibility cannot afford us to maybe think for much further right now. Our panelists are Ambassador Thomas Bagger, ambassador from Germany to Poland, and also someone who supported my cooperation with President Steinmeier, my dear friend, for all these years. So thank you, Thomas, for that. Then we have General Cavoli, SACEUR, someone who really in NATO, supported by other generals, other chiefs of armies, has dreamed up what to do, what we need to do. And I hope to hear from you, General, about that. Then we have Dan Fried, retired US diplomat, who is a Visa Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council and a long friend of Lennart Meri conference, of course. So thank you, Dan, being with us again. Nathalie Tocci, director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali, Italy, and also a long-standing friend of this conference. And then we have senior fellow at Carnegie Europe, Ambassador Vimont. Welcome to Lennart Meri conference as well. Well, in our preparation, I threatened that we start with, if I may say so, wish list. General Cavoli, if I may turn to you first. Many discuss how many years it will take Russia to rearm, and most settle somewhere at 5-ish. And also, we know that in this conference, discussion among generals has been more like when it comes than if it comes. All are convinced Russian intentions are not to change, and all are also convinced that the Russian regime is not going to change. So we have to be ready for a real standoff. Please don't be too polite. Tell us what we need to do and what we haven't done yet.
First of all, it's our duty to be prepared, right? So the big question, will we need to do this or not, is sort of not the point. The duty of militaries is to be prepared to defend our nations individually and then to defend NATO collectively in the case of the alliance. The Russian military's demise in Ukraine is something that has to be studied very closely. It has not been even. It's very easy to look and to think that the Russian military has collapsed or is in dire trouble, but in fact, it's been uneven. So the ground forces are greatly eroded. They have run into big problems, and they have lost a lot of people. They've lost a lot of equipment. On the other hand, they've also ingested a lot of people. And, the Russian army, the ground force today, is bigger than it was at the beginning of this conflict. So it still exists. The Air Force has lost less than 100 fighters and bombers. They have about 1,000 remaining. The Navy has lost almost nothing. Cyber has lost nothing. Space has lost nothing. So really, when we talk about the Russian military, we have to study it across all domains, and we have to be ready to deal with the Russian military into the future in all domains. So how long will it take to rebuild? The question is, how long will it take to rebuild to do what, right? They're capable of doing things today, as we see. So I think that there's not going to be a light switch that goes on or off. Now we need to be prepared. We don't need to be prepared now. We'll need to be prepared across a continuum from here going forward to defend our nations, and in the case of the alliance, to defend the territory of the states of the alliance. How long will it take NATO to be in a position to do that? Well, NATO's in a position to defend now. NATO's successfully deterring now. But we can always do things better. As you know, we've developed a series of regional plans that will give us blueprints for the forces that we need into the future and that nations can build against. And most nations have declared intentions to build significantly in terms of capacity and capability and readiness going forward, and that's going to be a very positive development for the alliance. And I would be remiss sitting here in Tallinn today if I did not point out that Estonia has been leading the way in that for some time.
General Herem looks very skeptical.
He's always happy, however. That's the thing about Mark.
So, thank you for these encouraging words. And what is most important is that you said NATO is successfully deterrent now, which of course is obvious because, I mean, nobody has dared to test our readiness. So you are, of course, technically absolutely correct. Let me now turn to Ambassador Bage. You are with one leg in Germany and another in Poland, probably the best placed person in Europe to try to explain to us a little bit. I mean, hearing all this discussion that the Russian intention is not changing and we need to do more, we still have, at least in CEE, a certain level of doubt that the whole West Europe is ready and its citizens and people are ready to support their politicians if their politicians decided to do far more. In a way, I'm unfair asking this question from a German, because Germany is the one big nation in Europe which will have in 5 years from now, hopefully radically better army structure than you've had. Albeit, let's be honest, it comes from a lower level. And in a way, you have done more in an understated way, and sometimes it has not been recognized. I definitely want to recognize it, but still, discussion, perceptions in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe. So please, Ambassador Bage, help us to understand.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And let me just briefly start by saying it's very good to be back in Tallinn, and thank you to those who were stubborn enough to get me here, even if only for one day. I should start by saying, sort of going back one step and saying that Russia's all-out war against Ukraine in 2022 came as a fundamental, serious strategic shock to almost everyone in Germany. May sound like a banality a year later, but it isn't. It's central to my argument that I will try to make. In many ways, we projected our own focus on economic rationality upon our adversary. And that was clearly a mistake. We thought this war was next to impossible because most of us felt that such a move would be suicidal for the Russian business model. And it was. And yet it happened. So our own imagination was what failed us, and actually us more than many of our Central and Eastern European partners. But that is exactly why the Zeitenwende, as the Chancellor called it, why the turning point in Germany is more than a set of policy adjustments on security defense, on Russia, on energy. I would argue that it represents a major shift, also a major mental shift, precisely because it ends the post-wall era in the German Weltanschauung, if you will, of the German way to look at the international environment. And since that was an era, this post-war era of unparalleled peace and economic prosperity for my country, that's not an easy thing to acknowledge. It's not an easy thing to let go and to prepare for something that will be a much rougher period ahead. So yes, we do not have the same threat perception as Poland or as Estonia, for that matter. When I think about it, one of the things that strike me is from when I grew up in West Germany as NATO's frontline state, Germany is one of the few countries where you can actually make the argument that its geography has changed. That doesn't happen often to countries. But I grew up in NATO's frontline state on the periphery, and now we are in the center of Europe. That has had a lot of positive changes, but also some consequences for our next to zero threat perception over 3 decades that we now have to grapple with. But I would argue that we have a significant shift, and that you have a broad spectrum of German politics now where there's a consensus that European security will have to be organized against Russia for the foreseeable future and no longer with Russia. And that in itself represents a sort of a major sort of not just policy shift, but really a shift of societal sentiment that politicians then have to work with responsibly, but also actively in the way you outlined. I'm not a great fan of Cold War parallels in this current environment, and listened carefully to the previous panel as well on what it had to say on the perspectives of other regions and what is happening in Europe. But I think there are some lessons we can learn from those days, sort of what I grew up with, what I studied in the pre-'89 days. And for example, that credible deterrence is actually the product of capabilities and resolve, i.e. political will. And I think my country now is on a path to correct what in hindsight, I would say was its biggest mistake, neglecting investments into its own strength, and that is above all military strength. But I would argue that we're also reassessing the dependencies and vulnerabilities that come from economic interdependence. And that is actually less a Russia debate, it's more a China debate as it plays out in my own country right now. So to put it differently, what kind of a security premium do we need to pay? Are we prepared to pay in moving away from an economic efficiency only prism that has brought us great prosperity over the past decades? And because much of our external economic interaction is governed by EU regulation, that is necessarily also a European debate. It's not just a German debate. But I would say you look at the opinion polls, depending on how the question is being asked, but you have a dramatic increase in support and approval for NATO membership. You have a significant support for higher defense spending in Germany, even, if you could say you would wish, certainly from Tallinn, you would wish for it to happen quicker, but it is underway, it will happen, and there is, I think, broad public support for it, and there is significant support for delivering heavy weapons to Ukraine. It's remarkably solid, despite a lot of noise that is being reported from the German public debate. And in closing, I would say, yes, history and geography make for a different debate in Germany than in Poland or in Estonia, and that will continue to be like that. But I do see a major shift in my country, both in government policy and in society more broadly, in a commitment to rebuilding critical military capabilities, but also the political resolve and societal consensus to actually defend what our societies are built on. And I'm sure we'll get to that, because what our societies are built on is first and foremost a normative core. And that is also something that is being brought back in this debate.
I will now risk a question I've long wanted to ask from a German, and I needed a panel and a think tankish situation for that. And I will ask a yes or no answer. You can elaborate later. But my question is, if Nord Stream 2 would not have been blown up would Germany still be using Russian gas?
No.
Thank you. Nathalie, on to you. Let's move further south. We just heard that in Germany the change is real, and all our nagging about well, let's say German energy markets not fitting in with European energy market objectives of diversification have been forgiven, I understand, thank you. But further south, you know Italy very well, but of course Europe as well. You worked in the heart of our Europe, responsible for the European foreign policy strategy. First time we ever had one. But if we look how things are going, then next generation Europe costs 800 billion and Ukrainian allocations have been 4 so far. And I have to say that since Munich conference, at least, I've sensed this, that, I mean, we are all so happy that we are also united and that we have so much changed our thinking and we are moving ahead in our thinking on lightning speed. And then in the periphery, you have always Ukrainian veterans, parliamentarians, NGOs who tell that, yes, we hear these words, but what's the tangible effect is still lacking for those who are now fighting the beast. And it has been heartbreaking, actually, to moderate Ukrainian dinner at Munich for me, because we had absolutely no answers.
So, I go back to a question that Tim Garton-Ash was asking in the first day of this conference. I don't know if Tim's here, but he said, you know, is there going to be a generation 22 in Europe? And in fairness, I actually think that, clearly in some parts of Europe, but not in other parts of Europe. So then the question becomes, does this mean that we're going to be more disunited moving forward when it comes to Russia or not? And I actually think that although indeed there are and there will continue to be different levels of threat perceptions, and Russia, which indeed is, I would say, on a whole, viewed as being big, bad, and ugly, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's therefore considered as representing the same level of threat everywhere. So although that is true, I actually see the unity that we've seen, which was relatively, I would say, unsurprising at the beginning of the war, given how obscene it all was and how it just came as a shock to everyone. But I actually think that that unity, or rather a reduced level of disunity, is actually going to continue moving forward. And that is not necessarily because, as I was saying earlier, the level of threat perception is the same, or it's becoming more convergent, but rather because there is less of a cost in adopting that harder line towards Russia than there used to be. And this gets us straight into the question of dependencies, or rather severed dependencies, that were really at the heart of, you know, in a country like my own, it wasn't necessarily love for Russia, it was a question of convenience. Now, the minute in which that convenience has gone, because those dependencies have been broken, and in fact, as a result of it, we realize that we're stronger, because I think the really, and this kind of gets me from the political to the energy/economic story, you know, after that first moment of solidarity, I remember perfectly well what the debate in Europe was round about the summer of last year. There's a peace versus justice camp. Now the disunity is going to start. That is because we're headed into a cold and expensive winter, social unrest, governments will change. Hey, in my country, a government did change. And you know, people were extremely concerned about it. That policy change hasn't happened. Because, yes, to an extent, we were lucky in China and the climate and all the rest of it, but we actually did something right. And as a result of diversifying sources, coordinating our storage levels, moving towards joint procurement on gas, accelerating the energy transition, and I could go on and on and on, we are in a fairly good place. And therefore, even if that threat perception differs, it doesn't actually necessarily lead to greater disunity. Now, that's the sort of positive side of the story. Let me perhaps briefly touch on the more concerning part of the story, which is actually defense related. Yes. Now, I think, again, in fairness, we have done a lot. We have revived NATO. We are not everywhere, but certainly in many parts of Europe, spending more on defense. Unprecedented what is happening within the EU, where the European Peace Facility is being used not only to provide weapons to a third state at war, but really represents the beginning of what could end up being a joint platform for weapons procurement. I mean, wow, right? I mean, this is the European Union that used to consider defense a dirty word. So I don't wish to undermine or to sort of, talk down everything that has been done, although I think the paradox of this moment is that Europe's defense dependence on the United States has increased. And that, I think, is not good news for Europe. I don't think it's good news for the United States, that actually increasingly needs to have a strong defense player in Europe. I kind of tend not to be critical about this because, frankly speaking, there is little that we can do about it because we are actually doing quite a lot. It's simply, and there's little point kind of crying over spilled milk. It's really the story about everything that should have happened in previous decades that we didn't do, and in a sense now we're paying the consequences on it. Final point that I wanted to make in terms of how this is also changing Europe it is really the way in which it has brought back the enlargement conversation, which is a NATO conversation, and it's an EU enlargement conversation. And again, in fairness, after 2007, we kind of thought that we didn't need to do enlargement anymore. Yes, it's true, the Balkans, not to mention Turkey, and the Eastern Partnership countries were not necessarily wonderfully democratic and peaceful and prosperous, but that grey zone was more or less stable. And this war has demonstrated that you're either in or out, and if you're out, bad things happen, or can happen, and those bad things have consequences for Europe as well, for the European Union as well. So I think it's brought back that strategic imperative of enlargement in a way, as I said, that I think we'd forgotten about.
Thank you, Nathalie. I heard Kurt Volker say a few days ago that green zones, actually, grey zones mean green lights. So
That's right.
I think this is pretty common.
That's
but
right.
Ambassador Vimont, I listened to all this, and we say, and Nathalie said, positive is the talk, negative is still, we haven't quite gotten there. And I'm a liberal market economist, and I tend to think markets are always right. And I was astonished that the defense industry took so long to get into any gear, to start producing cannons, ammunition, tanks, etc. And frankly, we are still sitting there. And if I look at the market perceptions, and yes, they may be wrong in short term, but middle and long term, they normally do not err. And they are not rushing to build new factories. Yes, a few are, Rheinmetall together with Ukrainians and so on. But overall, 2022, Europe spent less on defense than the year before, in real terms. Almost same in nominal terms, but considering inflation. So are we really sleepwalking into more tragedies while talking the right things? Could that be the case?
Thank you, first of all, for inviting me and thank you for this great question. I would have two answers to your question on different level. One is let's look at where we were 10 or 12 years ago inside the European Union. I'm part of that generation. When coming into the French diplomatic service, there was one principle: never allow the Commission to get involved in defense and security. Keep them out. And now we have a European Defense Fund, more than 7 billion euros for that purpose. We have a European Peace Fund that has financed all the military equipment support to Ukraine. And listen, here again, when I came into the European External Action Service, exactly on one of the first day when I was there, we had a delegation from the Sahel countries coming to see us. And of course, as always in Brussels, we told them, well, how can we help you with public health, agriculture, water resources, etc., etc. And they told us, we want weapons. We have to fight the jihadist group. And we told them, no way. This was 2011. We're 10 years later, and we have this huge fund that is doing exactly that. So I think there has been progress. And from our defense industries, the message has gone through. Here again, 10 years ago, some of these great companies were just dropping their defense and security department. They were closing it because they had no support from public budget for what they were trying to do. The change is huge, and the change is huge even in the market and the stock exchanges, where suddenly defense industries have started to be looked at as maybe a real opportunity in the years ahead. That's the first point. I think we're moving in a new ground, and this is not going to change. I mean, I'm astonished. 1 week ago, can you think about it? 1 week ago, the European Commission put down a proposition where some of the structural fund money is going to be allocated to defense industries. Now, if you had told me that 5 years ago, I would never have believed it, and it's there. I don't know what the member states are going to make out of that proposition, but we will see. But it's going to be interesting. So this is a major change. But your point, and this is the second point I want to go to, has to do with war economy, which is something a bit different, which is how do you focus and bring all people together, fighting for the good cause and fighting for Ukraine, something we did in the First World War, in the Second World War, certainly in the First World War more than ever, where we still have vivid memories in some parts of Paris, where we had factories where people were working day and night to support our soldiers in Verdun and elsewhere. This is different because, let's be honest, this war is totally different. We are supporting Ukraine, but we're not fighting ourselves. So there you need the kind of mindset Thomas was talking about of you. We need a shift in our mentality to be able to focus, to change the attitude of our industries so that they can ramp up and shore up their efforts. It's complicated. This is a war where we're in and out at the same time, where public opinion is very much supportive, but it's, going to the movie house in the afternoon and feels still very much distance what's happening on the Ukrainian front. So this is a war where we need to adapt our mentality to what is going on, and I think that is important. Could I just add 2 points, if you allow me, very quickly, about moving from the financial and industrial efforts to the more global picture of security order. The first one is, if Europeans are going to pay more, and I think they are, and I think they're going to do it more and more, then they have to play more also. You pay, then you play. Then you need to take responsibilities in the security field. You need to be there. We need to look at all the details that are rather complicated with regard to an increased European effort in security and defense. Exports control, control of the dual use new tech in defense field. The need to not only talk about complementarity between European defense and NATO, but do it, start doing it, act. Be much more involved in the everyday work, and I'm sure the General has much more to say about this. That's the first point. The second point is that the new European security order will be much more than simply defense matters, as Nathalie was just saying about enlargement. And in my opinion, that means inventing new tools, being much more ambitious, having a new vision. Enlargement as it stands has never been really used for geopolitical purposes. the big enlargement of 2004 was in a time of peace at the time. So it was much more about the traditional merits of each country to get involved into the single market, to approximate all norms and standards, etc. Now we're going to build an enlargement process with a country that is at war, with other countries that are very close to the front line, and that makes of the enlargement process something totally different. And I think we have to think about this. And it will not be only about inventing a gradual process for enlargement. For me, it's much more than that. And this, we have to think about it much more. And it brings me back at the end of the day to the fact, the kind of debate we had, naturally enough, when the Berlin Wall fell, 1989, 1990, where our answer, in fact, as Europeans, was mostly the Maastricht Treaty. Very much self-centered, single market, single currency, etc. We missed the geopolitical mindset and the change of the geopolitical mindset. We have another chance here. Do it over. Try again. And this is where I think we need to be much more ambitious.
Thank you. Since you spoke about enlargement, I'll come to you then now from this point of view.
Yeah.
What's the value of doing an enlargement, building a pre-accession program to help build institutions in Ukraine, while trying also to catch international financing for rebuilding Ukraine? And all this, I mean, if Ukraine might not be safe at all, my guess is that unless there is a rock-solid security guarantee for Ukraine, which is NATO membership, which I think you also support, we will be pretty much alone with public funds to rebuild Ukraine, because no one else will believe that this is long-term. What is your wish list for Europeans to get us into the better place?
The question you're asking is, what do we want? What are we after? The we, in this case, being the transatlantic community.
Precisely.
A Europe whole and free was our answer to the strategic challenge of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And it took us years to figure out what that meant in practice, but it meant, as it turns out, the twin enlargements.
Yeah.
That happened in times of peace. Now we are dealing with a wartime situation. But do we mean it or not? More specifically, is Ukraine part of our transatlantic family, or is it not?
For us here, the answer is obvious. For
The
others,
Ukrainians in the 90s may not have been sure where they belonged, but on the Maidan, in 2013 and 2014, they were flying the EU flag. They were making a civilizational choice, and Vladimir Putin knew it, which is why he invaded.
because he knew that we will drop Ukraine like a hot potato if he invades, like we did to Georgia.
But we didn't drop Ukraine like a hot potato. Our response after 2014, but especially after 2022, was stronger, more sustained, and more strategically coherent than Putin expected, and that maybe we ourselves expected. But the question is, what are we after? And it seems to me that we have to be after integrating Ukraine into our family. NATO enlargement is a means to an end. That end is a Europe whole, free, and at peace. Now, somebody's going to say, it's too hard because there's a war. Now, it is much harder. And I'm not suggesting that it's easy. But Kurt Volker made the point, which you quoted, that gray zones lead to instability. And the way I would put it is, y'all enjoy the last 15 months? The last 15 months is what happens if Ukraine is outside of our family because it's just too far away and just too difficult. That we may argue that that's a sign of goodwill or stability, but Putin will take that as a sign of weakness and an invitation to invade again when he can. And, you know, we all know this. I'm not trying to make the case for a NATO membership invitation at Vilnius. That's not happening, and it shouldn't happen. I'm making a larger point, that we have to mean seriously what we have said for many years about Europe whole and free. We have to mean it. And Ukraine is fighting in the name of its own European future. And we have to give them that chance. And then, if that's what we've decided on as a strategic objective, the operational questions, how you do it, when you do it, what are the mechanisms, how do we get from here to there, those are all tough questions. I mean, the Biden administration is wrestling with all of that. And I have a lot of sympathy for them because it isn't easy. But if we can be clear about the goal, then the operational difficulties may seem to me to be resolvable. Now, I was at the Bucharest NATO summit. It was a goddamn mess. But it did at least result in a decision, however it came about, that in the end, Ukraine belongs in NATO. That's its place. For a long time, in fact, at Bucharest, France and Germany were opposed to a membership action plan. I get it. I was in the Bush administration then, and we lost that battle. But listen to what you've just heard. The German ambassador to Poland has said, and I've heard it from many other German officials, that European security has to be organized not with Russia, but against Russia. That's a really big deal. That is a strategic statement of profound importance. That's the kind of thing that Estonians have been saying, and Poles and others have been saying for years. And now the Germans are there. That has consequences. The French, it seems to me, Pierre, are open to this kind of a discussion. And we need now to discuss, to reaffirm what it is we're after, and then to discuss how we get there. And what we're after, it seems to me, is a Europe whole and free, which includes Ukraine. And then the rest is operational challenges. Last thought, much depends on the battlefield. The Russians are losing the war, but they haven't lost. The Ukrainians have not yet won. Much will depend on the way this comes about, but we need to be clear in our own minds what our strategic objective is. Final thought, I promise. Every argument against Ukraine joining our family, I have heard with respect to Poland in the early 90s, to the Baltics in the late 90s. It's too far, they're not ready, it's destabilizing, Moscow will go crazy, we have to have a gray zone. I remember the debates. And if we had not enlarged NATO to include the Baltic states, we would not be dealing with the invasion of Ukraine, we'd be dealing with the occupation of Estonia.
Right, we know that.
Of course we know that. Of course we know that. We succeeded. We did the right thing, and let's build on that success and those principles.
It is in one way very hopeful what you say, but from the other way, as you cite all our good deeds and thoughts for Europe whole and free, since Bucharest summit, also Crimean sanctions and everything, yet they were not enough to deter. And this is the final point right now where we sit, yet they were not enough to deter. Some of you spoke pretty lengthily, but some of you obviously not think tankers and spoke so shortly. They get a second chance. General Cavoli, Ambassador Bagger. General Cavoli, listening to all this, we are getting there, we are thinking, we need to think, we need to rethink, and when try to imagine there is an emergency, let's not specify which kind of emergency, day from tomorrow. As you said, NATO is ready to deter, ready to defend already right now. How sure and secure you feel that the bottleneck or the weakest link in the chain is not your political command? what kind of irritation? I mean, there could be some kind of irritation. Somebody occupies a little bit of land somewhere on NATO. Nobody's dead. It's wood. Eastern Europe is wood covered after all, and it's not densely populated. And then sit there with the political command, the ministers of defense, prime ministers, and discuss what does it mean? Is this worth going to action now, or are we escalating? Should we be escalating? No one is dead, just land grab. I mean, what's your feeling? I know it's a tough question to ask from a general, but it must go through your mind.
It's a fair question. But I'll answer it almost philosophically at first, right? The political decision to go to war will never be the bottleneck of the military for our alliance, because our alliance exists as a political body, and warfare is an expression of politics. So it can't be the bottleneck. It's the thing that warfare exists because of. So now in a pure operational sense, I think is what you were getting at, of course, right? Fast decision making is always useful, because the challenge is, if we take the Baltics as an example, the challenge of defending Estonia is time and distance. You know, how long does it take us to move forces into position? So fast decision making is always important. Some of that has to do with the way we construct our plans, however, and there are many things we can do inside of our plans that give us greater speed. And then there are many things that we can do in host nation defense planning, national defense planning, that will give us a greater advantage in terms of time. So yeah, as an operational matter, of course, we want fast decision making. But we should never put the cart before the horse, right? I mean, the decision making is the point. It is a political decision to go into a fight, and it should always be one in our alliance.
Do you feel our political minds are exercised enough to make the right decision to allow the military to go into action?
I think it's uneven in some places and among some leaders. There's a great focus on these questions. Other places there is not. We do have exercises inside NATO that work on the political military nexus of decision making, and they're always extremely useful.
Thomas, it doesn't get easier for you, but I have to ask, Vilnius, NATO-Russia Founding Act, with the new wording on Ukraine, because if we just repeat what we've been telling from 2008, and we already know this wasn't deterrent enough, I mean, what should be the positive outcome for you from Vilnius?
Well, I'm not involved in all the many consultations that are going on right now as we speak in trying to hammer out the package for Vilnius. But I think, following up on what Dan said, the Europe whole and free as we envisaged it when the wall fell, or as Gorbachev liked to call it, the common European house, had an idea that it would encompass Russia, and that there would be something on the path as we would move there, would have something like a common neighborhood. Well, as you said, that common neighborhood no longer exists. It became contested territory, and now it's war territory. And so, you know, what got us, our governments, to a different point, a different argument in 2008 in Bucharest, is no longer there. Why? Because of Putin's decision to go to war. We will have a hard dividing line in Europe, and Ukraine will be on our side of that dividing line. And so I think that question is essentially answered, not because we have answered it, but he has answered it for us. Right. And now come the operational consequences of that. How do we go about operationalizing that? I can't do that for Vilnius. I'm not in a position to do that. But I don't think that the NATO-Russia Founding Act, whatever we do to it, should restrain us from doing the necessary things in strengthening NATO's eastern flank, for example. But I'm not in a position to say here is exactly what will constitute a positive outcome. But I don't think I'm not in a position to make the case the way you did, and we had this discussion before. But I also don't think that I have much of a disagreement with the way we look at the situation.
Well said.
Yes, there are hands raised already in the auditorium, so let's find the microphones and open the discussion now. I think you get the prize for the first question there for speed, Kurt, please.
Thanks very much. In U.S. presidential debates, they have a rule that if you're mentioned, you get to respond to the question. So I'll take advantage of that. And to repeat, yes, gray zones are green lights. And I think what I've picked up in this conference and traveling in Europe elsewhere this week is I think European allies are beginning to realize that in ways that the United States has not. And I would point to a couple of things. One of them, there's a commitment to Ukraine ultimately becoming a member of the European Union, candidate status being granted. But I think everybody knows that it can't be a member of the European Union if it's not secure. The second thing is we're all talking about Ukraine economic reconstruction and recovery. And that is not going to be done with European and American taxpayer money. It's going to be done by investment, and it's going to be done by building an economy. And the private sector, as you said, Kersti, wants to know, will Ukraine be there? And the only way to convincingly say that, yes, Ukraine will be there is if they have security. And finally, we're talking about an ideology here of genocide, of imperialism, of authoritarianism that believes that Ukraine doesn't exist, that there's a right of Russia to rule other countries. That is something that is dangerous for all of us. And again, that only stops if we can stop it through means of security. And when you think about security guarantees for Ukraine, there's no credible security guarantee that Vladimir Putin would pay attention to if the United States is not part of it. But if the United States is part of it, I don't believe there's any way that we'll get an American Senate to vote in favor or to support security commitment in the United States and leave our allies off the hook. It has to be everybody. It has to be NATO. And so I think this is inevitably where it's going. And I think our European allies are coming around to this very quickly. I worry that we will underperform at Vilnius. I think that just 2 months away, we run the risk of not saying this and not doing enough, and as a result, sending all of the wrong signals to Putin and to Ukraine. So I think the question I would have, and I don't know whether Dan or Pierre, Thomas already tried to answer this, what is the danger of getting it wrong in Vilnius, and how far can we go right now to make sure that we are sending the right signal about what we see for the future?
I think Dan, you could try. It's a hard one, but this actually, the whole auditorium here senses and feels this way. We are not doing enough, hence we are still only talking, we are not moving anywhere.
The logic of the U.S. government's position will take it in the direction Kurt Volker is outlining. I have some sympathy for the Biden administration's hesitation because they are trying to think through the consequences. I get that. But hesitation is one thing and strategic ambiguity is another. And I hope that the signals of strategic direction are clear. Secondly, I think the Biden administration is rightly traumatized by what happened at Bucharest, where the United States ended up, pushing and failing. But the situation is not the same. I've just listened to senior French and German colleagues say it's not like Bucharest. And I think the way is open for a strategic statement that Ukraine belongs in our family, and then the rest is tough, challenging, but in some sense the rest is detail. And that's where I hope we end up.
Well, we have to trust the wisdom. The lady in back, because we need gender balance. Please stand up, find a microphone.
There are other reasons to call on me, but thank you very much. I'm Terry Schultz. I cover NATO and the EU. Thank you. Every day out at NATO, right, General Cavoli? So my question is going back to Pierre's use of the term war economy, because we're seeing that thrown around by Thierry Breton in Brussels with zero follow-up on what that means practically. When you use a term like that, it seems it would have to mean something, right? I mean, this could mean as far as nationalizing defense. But yet the Commission is using this to try to propel countries to use the European peace funds now and to get those contracts to the militaries, which is not happening. And we hear it just from industry a couple of days ago. We're still not getting those contracts. I don't understand why. So I want to know why that term is being used if you are not prepared, you not being in the institutions now, but if you're not prepared to move further on why use the term. And Ambassador Bagger, when you hear that term used as a German in Poland, a country which actually is giving everything it can, how does that ring in German ears? Not well, I suppose. And General Cavoli, are you worried, I know you're not responsible for the ammunition to Ukraine, but are you worried that it's even moving so slowly that you will not be able to replenish the stockpiles that NATO is saying right now it's fine to go a little bit below the comfort level in order to get it to Ukraine, but you're not even on track to replenish those a year or 2 years from now with those speed things are going now? And if Dan or Nathalie would like to say something, I'm welcome. Thank you very much, Kersti.
So, ambassadors first. Ambassador Vimont, then Ambassador Bagger.
You let me go before the soldier. That is dangerous.
Yes, because he will thereafter come and qualify your words, I know.
Let me answer very quickly. I couldn't disagree more with your question, because I think from the starting from the European perspective, the European level, a lot is going on. And it started, in fact, in this country with the Estonian Prime Minister proposing this collective purchase of military ammunition. And the work is going on. It's going on in the traditional European way. It's not as swift as we would like. You have to go through 27 member states' approval. But this has been moving, and this is going ahead. Then there is what can be done by each and every member state, and that's another matter. It's for national governments to take it over and to try to push out. And here again, let's be honest, for industrialists to move into that direction can take time, all the more so, as I was saying earlier, there isn't exactly the same kind of pressure as we have seen, for instance, in First World War. We are in a different situation. Let's be honest, there's a little bit of hypocrisy from all of us, because we're supporting Ukraine in the best way we can, but we're not, as we like to say, co-belligerent. We are not on the field, and therefore for our industries, it is here a big change and something that takes time, and we have to accept that.
Thomas, hearing all this and these questions, I mean, this is precisely what we are afraid in this part of the Europe, the paralysis. Coming out of the paralysis takes so long time, and while we still measure time in weeks and months, Ukrainians right now measure this time in death, lives lost. So what you are now on our side. What can we do to get things move quicker? What else?
I think it was my friend Ivan Krastiev who said you should ask about people's nightmares. The Polish nightmare, and I would assume the Estonian as well, is occupation. The German nightmare is war.
And the Commission's nightmare is getting things legally right.
And that... But it's important because it makes for it gives words and concepts a different connotation and a different ring in people's ears. You will not have a positive response to the term war economy in Germany, and it is not the right way to mobilize the effort. I don't think so. It has become fashionable in some quarters to criticized Germany for its debates, for its slowness, and all of that. And I get it from a Polish point of view, which I'm exposed to every day. I get that.
Here we are nastier to Italians, Portuguese, and Spanish. Don't worry.
But what can I answer to that? I can say I think there is strength in having 3/4 of German society and the political spectrum in consensus behind the basic pillars of the Zeitenwende on security and defense. And if others are faster in delivering support, they should be rightfully proud of it. But I am proud that Germany today is the largest supporter militarily of Ukraine in the European Union. I'm proud that most of the air defense assets which protect Ukraine's skies have been delivered by Germany. And I am confident that there is much more to come from Germany, as we've heard this weekend from the Chancellor as well, from the Defense Minister, as President Zelensky is in Berlin. And so now we discuss that the replenishing on the national side is going too slow, which is true. And Minister Pistorius, as the new Minister of Defense, has made that his number 1B priority after filling the pipeline for Ukraine support. But it will happen. I'm not saying it will be finally fast enough for Polish or Estonian or Latvian expectations, but it will happen. And I think what is important is that we don't take these different the differing perception of existential threat as a fundamental question mark that says the others still don't get it. My point is we do get it, but you do have to understand that history and geography are immensely powerful teachers, and they have taught us different lessons. But we are part of one alliance, part of one European Union. So that is why we need that constant conversation. That is different in Italy than it is in Germany, and certainly as in Poland or in France. But we've actually been quite good at that. But we will not. So that's what I tell my Polish colleagues. There is a huge opportunity in the strategic alignment that you see because of the German Zeitenwende, where German policies are actually moving in a Polish direction. But there will not be full alignment. And right now, they obviously don't see the opportunity, or they don't grasp the opportunity. But it is there. But it's ours to make the most of it.
As I started my statement, I think you, meaning Germany, is now on our side. I know Germany has moved a lot, and Germany maybe indeed is becoming the biggest force we can all line up behind in order to convince those even further afield. And this even further afield, listening also to today's panel, is becoming a real worry for us. Can we get enough mass to change things quite quickly? Because yes, you mentioned Baltic expectations of replenishing the stockpile, but it's not about Baltic expectations. It's about Russian intentions, and then that's different. But Nathalie.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to this, and to Terry's question on the slowness, I think it's worth though reflecting about what is behind some of these disagreements. So take the ammunition story, and in a sense the kind of the French-Polish divide here. And actually, if you kind of scratch the surface of that, there are pretty important arguments on both sides. I mean, you look at it from the sort of the Polish priority, which I guess is the same here, are basically saying this is a question of speed. We just need to get ammunition wherever it comes from and get it as quickly as possible into Ukraine. Absolutely correct. And yet, if we go back to this issue of the war economy, well, the war economy in Europe is about putting European defense industry on that war economy footing. And so there is merit in a sense. I mean, normally it doesn't come from me, but there is merit to a French argument that says we just need to make sure that that ammunition is European. We're not only buying it from elsewhere. So I think, it's worth reflecting about the fact that behind the slowness is not paralysis, but it is a question of finding the right equilibrium between two arguments, both of which are actually fairly compelling, precisely because there has been a Zeitenwende all round, or there should be a Zeitenwende all round. Likewise on this question of, using cohesion funds for weapons. I mean, this is not exactly intuitive, right? I mean, this is a Copernican revolution. Persuading those member states that are very far from the front line, that rather than spending monies spending funds in whatever, Calabria, they've got to spend them on defense industry to send weapons to Ukraine. I mean, important. People like me get the argument, but it just takes time to make that argument compelling for everyone. Very last point, if I may, back to Kurt's point, which I think was fantastically important. Why is there a difference between that European consciousness and in the US? Of course, in one case, it is about you, the other case, it's about NATO, but also what's behind these two sets of enlargements. In the case of the EU, at the moment, and the point is it will have to change, but at the moment it's about solidarity and therefore symbolism and consolidation of democracy. And this is a longer-term story. In the case of NATO, it's about security/economy, given the nexus with economic reconstruction. Now, these things are connected, but in a sense, it's easier, quote unquote, for the enlargement, the EU enlargement question to be back on the agenda. And the point is, how is it that we can actually make one weave into the other for precisely the reasons that you were saying? One is actually not going to happen without the other.
Well, thank you. I'm sure General Cavoli will forgive me for not forcing him to answer this question, whether he really thinks he has enough. But there was a question over there. Yes, please. I actually thought one, yeah. You, please. You can do both. So,
okay, thank you.
But do it in a concise way, both you two, and then we will get it. No speeches, only questions.
Yeah, Tom O'Donnell. I'm at Wilson Center in Washington, but I work in Berlin for 10, 11 years now on energy and security. This is sort of to German ambassador and the commander. Look, there's a second front, which we haven't mentioned here, which is the economic and energy impact on Europe itself. And when you hear the Russians talk about this, they have some they have some hope for this front. And in Germany, I'll say in Berlin, the discussion has been about the deindustrialization, which energy is a big problem, the price and so forth. But I mean, you have one group of people who say, well, that's great, it's the fastest path to net zero. And then you have other more realistic people who really don't have an answer when you talk to people in the government. So by prolonging the war, and excuse me, but the analogy to Vietnam, the Vietnamese had defeated us. We were on the coast and bombed the country to hell for a long time. Even our armed forces were in dissolution. 1 or 2 presidents had to resign, and we didn't give up. And so that was a democracy. So I wonder, how is Europe going to deal with this other front to bring this to a conclusion, even if the Ukrainians go to the borders?
Thomas will answer that, but yes, please, the second question.
So Michael McFall from Stanford. I want to get beyond just Europe whole and free, and I want the panel, and Dan, I'm looking at you, because the people in the government can't do as much as others, but I want you to help them write the communique right now. We get that there's not going to be an invitation in Vilnius, but we also can't have an answer like President Zelensky got when he visited the White House. And I want to quote him here. He says, I would like to discuss with President Biden, this is September 1, 2021, his vision and his government's vision of Ukraine's chances to join NATO and the time frame for this accession. And as you know better than I do, Dan, but I want to hear everybody's concrete ideas, okay? The argument then is we got to give vague answers because we don't want Putin to invade Ukraine. Well, after President Zelensky said that, Putin did invade Ukraine. So we can't use that argument again. So concretely, what between membership in Vilnius versus just giving the same bland answer that President Zelensky got when he visited the Oval Office? Could we give some ideas for that? And one concrete idea I have, announce ATACMS and F-16s. That would make President Zelensky very happy.
Well, good, concrete fighting spirit. And not only over a microphone over there. Thank you, Thomas, and then Dan.
Well, since you opened that path for me, I'll pass that concrete question to Dan, because there's nothing I can say to that from here. I'll say something on the first question. Yes, you point to a very important issue, and that's why I wanted to raise at least once in my opening statement the whole question of reassessing dependencies and resulting vulnerabilities. I have answered no to your question.
Yes.
Why did we not believe that Russia would invade Ukraine? Because we felt it would be suicidal for Russia, because they would destroy their own business model. And yet they did. We failed to see that they were actually acting on historical ideas of historical greatness and mythology, and not on our economic rationality. But I still believe we were right, that it was economically suicidal, because they did destroy their business model. We would no longer import Russian gas or other kinds of energy. But that, of course, is a costly, quick change, and then a much more costly and more complicated, longer transformation. And everything plays into it. The industrial transformation, the energy transformation. I can only say, as a German diplomat, when we ask the question in this session, what are the principles of the future security architecture in Europe, from a German point of view, we have to invest in our own strength. For me, that is primarily military right now, because that's what we've neglected most. But quite obviously, if we lose our industrial, i.e. our economic strength, Europe will be in trouble as well. And so getting that right is as important as getting the military part of it right when we look at the longer term, and when we talk about architecture, we necessarily talk about the longer term. I will not go into details. You know full well that there's a lively debate in Berlin, politically, in society, with industry, what is doable, what are the timelines, how costly will it be, is it a fantasy, can you do it only with nuclear energy or also without it? The Poles have different opinions than the Germans. The French have different opinions than the Germans. Okay, we'll find out. But I think we've just proven how adaptable we are when push comes to shove. And that is what makes me optimistic that we will be able to solve that question as well.
Thank you, Dan, the American question.
All right. So I'm stuck. The Biden administration recalls institutionally the alliance's division at Bucharest. So turn a liability into a challenge and an advantage. At Vilnius, if the US, Germany, France, and the whole alliance says, yeah, that was then, this is now, that's a strong message. The wording can be, we are serious that Ukraine's future is with us as a member of our alliance. It's the Bucharest language, but this time we mean it.
and why should Russians believe it?
Well, the Russian, so the first is to make the statement, and if the French and Germans then say, yeah, we were divided at Bucharest. We did have a split, and no longer. It's not the same. That's a profound message. And that will the Russians will hear that, and then, the subtext is, we told you not to invade. You didn't listen, and what did you expect? But the second part is, and therefore what? You're not going to offer the membership now, so therefore NATO has to fill from the gap between where we are now and where we want to be with concrete programs, but in the context of an agreement about where we are headed. That's doable. Then you turn to somebody like Kurt Volker or Sandy Vershbow or real American NATO nicks, or the Poles, the Estonians, there's lots of expertise. and you fill a program, but that program of steps has to be seen as taking us toward that agreed goal and meaning it. And of course, let's not forget, the battlefield situation will color a lot. Okay, the war's not going to be won by Vilnius, but we'll see where we are. There are lots of ways to project strategic resolution. And we can figure out a way, and I think we are closer to that than many people recognize, even in the Biden administration. We're closer to that than we think. And, you know, the Biden people who are working this issue are exhausted. They've been running flat out, and I have a lot of sympathy for them, and they've accomplished a great deal. And what I tell them, and Mike, you may tell them the same thing, is you're closer to success than you realize. Do you realize that it could be a vindication? So back the Ukrainians and mean it. And then we can get there.
Thank you. Please. Microphone here. Yes, coming.
Yes, thank you. I'm Laure Mendeville from French daily Le Figaro. So I hear Dan Fried saying that he has the feeling that both the Germans and the French are actually now, in favor of, in Vilnius, asserting a position, asserting the fact that Ukraine is within the alliance as a family, that it's coming, it will be a member of the alliance. But, as a French journalist, I'm still feeling a very strong strategic ambiguity in France regarding the very issue of what we think about where Ukraine should be. And I would really like, Pierre Vimont to give his understanding of the French official position as we are, headed to Vilnius, because there's something which is still unclear, according to me, about that. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. I feel as well that comparing to the beginning of the year, French and Germans have moved a lot, but how far, Pierre?
Somebody was saying in France a long time ago that you only get out of ambiguity to your detriment. So I'll be very careful. First of all...
Then what is French nightmare? For Poland and Germany, what is French nightmare?
I don't know. I don't know yet, but I will think about it. But first of all, Xavier Châtel, who has official function, said very brilliantly, I think yesterday at some point in a panel in NATO, that for France, Vilnius was important to show to Ukraine our support. And from all the discussion I've heard up to now, I think for me, the main message that must come out of Vilnius is that we are all united. And it seems to me that as we go on with those kind of narrative opposing each other all the time is the worst support we can give to Ukraine. Vilnius must be a show of unity from all the allies against the Russian aggression. It's just as simple as that, in my opinion. That's the first thing. Then we all know that, all those former or ongoing diplomats, current diplomats, that you can find words around this kind of message of unity. And I think that's really the most important. As for France, we're totally in support of that. I think to some extent I can say that because I'm a retired diplomat. France is a much more comfortable position than in Bucharest. We are watching what is going on between Washington and others. But yet, I think once again, what we're really looking for is a show of support to Ukraine. And maybe Ambassador McFaul was talking about more supplies being given by different capitals. Berlin has just announced more. We ourselves are going in the same direction. I think talking about strategic ambiguity about France at the moment with regard to Ukraine is somewhat inaccurate in my opinion. Everybody has noticed Macron's position have moved, strengthened, and there is little ambiguity in what he's saying today about Ukraine, in my opinion.
Yeah, I do agree that maintaining unity is extremely important. But I mean, if the common denominator is so low that the whole Central Eastern Europe howls in disappointment, I'm afraid then we are in a weaker position after Vilnius than we are before Vilnius, while we're still hopeful.
I would be careful, Kersti, about being so self-flagellating all the time. It's not a low common denominator. As David, as we were all saying a few minutes ago, and as Dan was saying, if you look back at Bucharest, we're in a totally different position today, and I think that's very important. Could I add, because I can talk about something I know much more, which is the European Union. Look at the unbelievable step France, and to some extent Germany, but I'm talking about France because France has always been considered as one of the countries inside the European Union that was the most reluctant towards enlargement in general. And look at what happened last year in June, and the way Macron has pushed everybody to move forward to open the door for Ukrainian candidacy. These are big changes. You have to listen to it a little bit more and understand that these are pivotal moments in Europe. And by the way, my warning call is that now we have a difficult task in front of you, is how to make this enlargement a success. But we're moving into that direction. The Commission is moving ahead. And that's very impressive compared to the position we were taking a few years ago.
Progress is a fair point.
Can I just add to this? I mean, yeah. I actually think the way in which the political dynamic underpinning Bucharest and Vilnius has fundamentally changed, in which in the former case there was a half-baked US push and a determined West European resistance, as opposed to a political dynamic heading into Vilnius in which there is US reluctance, East European push, and West European acceptance is fundamentally different. Now, the outcome, we'll see what the wording ends up being, and the outcome may not be ideal, and it never is, but this is a sea change. I mean, I think we should appreciate this.
Thank you, Thomas. My predecessor, former president of Estonia, please, question from you, and then somebody who has a question for General Cavoli jumps up after Thomas, because he has not been...
Well, this may be partially also for the General. We can actually distinguish three phases of where we stand. The end stop would be full membership in NATO. The current phase where we're talking about ramping up industrial production is to end the war. There will be a period between when we say the war is over and then the end station. And that period could be a year, it could be 10 years, whatever it is, but that period will require fundamental security guarantees for Ukraine, and probably in the absence of a yet achieved NATO membership. I'm interested in the vision of what that looks like.
General, President asked that you may have a view. I know it's more political.
I don't have a view on that. That's yes. A profoundly policy matter that my job will be to implement.
So we come back to Dan, I'm afraid. Because, I mean, if we say yes, indeed, soon after the war ends, I mean, there will be weekly shelling for a long, long, long time.
The logic of your question is to make that interim period shorter rather than longer, right? Ambiguity could favor Putin. However, much depends on the way this phase of the war ends. The Ukrainians could succeed. The Russians could be defeated and know they're defeated, or not, or worse outcomes. This is the kind of operational discussion that we ought to be having. We need, though, to bookend that discussion by solidifying where we are on the end state. And I think that that is possible. Then it becomes an operational question. There are a number of people who are talking about security arrangements with Ukraine that are not a NATO guarantee, but are helping them defend themselves, the porcupine strategy, the Israeli strategy. I don't want to slam those because who knows, we may have to live with them and I may have to defend them. But I much prefer to have them as interim measures toward the agreed, leading to the agreed endpoint. And by the way, the question about, the argument against Baltic NATO membership is Estonia is indefensible. Okay, Ukraine is defensible. We know that because they've defended themselves with only our weapons. Imagine what would have happened if the Russians had attacked and the US, the NATO air forces had given the Ukrainians backup. So these questions are answerable. They are, the general's right, these are profoundly strategic questions. They are for the political leadership of the country. But we're going to have to deal with this because Putin has forced us to, because he started this war. And we are now most of the governments in the alliance have been dealing with the day-to-day problem of defending Ukraine and have not had time to systematically think through the strategic implications. But the summits, both in Vilnius and Washington next year, right, are forcing us to do so. And I think we're closing in on something better. Messy, incomplete, awful in some ways, but I think we're going to get there.
Thomas wanted to have a short comment, and then I will take two more questions. Fourth line here, lady in the second line, and then we are closing. Thomas, please.
I just sort of, when I listened to the previous session on, I think Raja Mohan, who advised, the Europe to be more geopolitical. And I think that is one of the building principles of that future security architecture. But Putin not only forced upon us also that geopolitical question, he also forced upon us something else. Our societies do not carry their normative foundations just as convenient camouflage. Democracies, they cannot survive when they are cynical at the core. We may not live up to our values each and every day, but that doesn't mean that we don't take them seriously. Putin looked at us cynically as he looked at his own society and his own country, and he got us wrong. His own imagination failed him. And I think that is important. He inadvertently, but he reminded us also of the importance of the normative core of who we are. And I say that because, Mr. President, because I think that also informs sort of the way we will approach those years. And I can't give you an answer, whether that will be a decade or 2 years or 7 years or what it will be. I don't know. But I think apart from these geopolitical considerations, the other side of that answer is our normative closeness to the Ukrainian people, to the Ukrainian society, as it has been reaffirmed in these past 15 months. And why? Not because we were so brilliant to bring it up ourselves, but because Putin forced it upon us, upon the Ukrainians, but also upon us.
Thank you. Where's the microphone, please? Over there. Yes, you, and then second line, lady there.
Thank you. Charlie Salonius Pasternak from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Question to General Cavoli. We've been talking about security architecture. Architecture exists within a context. So what would you need from political decision makers, or say the Commission, industry, to ensure that you and your successors can operate in a global context? And maybe conversely, based on then your discussions with colleagues or counterparts, Japan, Korea, Morocco, what might they want to see in this European security architecture?
Well, thank you. We get the last question and then the answers.
I'm Leila Aliva from Oxford, University of Oxford. All the president's horses and all the president's men could not anticipate and outsmart the autocrat.
My question is, what is the major lesson learned from this failure of anticipate and prevent? Are we imagining more militarized, like 50% of our budgets, military budgets in the future, being increased to 50% of military budget? Or are we going to make some conclusions about other parts of our life? Is it about, as you mentioned, the soft power? Is it something about it? Thank you. Or are we going to be more and more militarized as a result of this? Thank you.
General, in a way, I feel you could answer both these questions.
Sure. We need exactly what you said, is a global context. That is, it's impossible to see a future architecture that deals with Russia that does not include a global context, right? I mean, even now. Likewise with the People's Republic of China, and the two of them together especially create for us global problems. So I think the answer to your question, or my answer to your question, is embedded inside your question, which is that's exactly what we need to take a global approach. And that includes both at a policy level and architectures, as you were describing them, as well as military planning and approaches. I don't think there was a failure to anticipate. If we look back, the United States was declaring loudly to everybody that this was going to happen. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, but the spending question. Should we spend more, or could we hope to do something with the soft power?
2% is a floor, not a ceiling. It's an aim. I think that when I look at the plans that we've developed and the force structure requirements that emanate from those plans, there's plenty of room for defense spending to provide readiness as well as force structure. There's plenty of room for greater defense spending.
Let's remind us that only 9 member states did meet the criterion of 2%. If everybody did, there will be lots and lots of more leeway. But right. I tend to disagree with the thinking that even 3, 4, 5 would be militarizing our societies. I see my panel is nodding. So,
when I served in the West German military in the mid-1980s, we were spending 3% plus of GDP on defense. That's right. And maintained an army of next to 500,000 men in uniform. And I did not have the feeling that I grew up in a militarized society.
I would agree. I mean, the United States during the Cold War spent between 4 and 6% for decades. And yeah, I don't think it was a militarized
Nathalie,
society.
you get the last short word, and then we were asked to kindly remove ourselves to the front line. So let's find seats over there thereafter. So over to you, Nathalie.
Leila, to your question, I mean, I think the lesson learned is that we need to take ideas and ideology seriously. And that is both our ideas, and this goes back to Thomas's normative foundations, but unfortunately also nasty ideologies elsewhere. And we cannot assume that our material rationality is going to do the trick. And that is, to me, I mean, the military point is the outcome of that realization, of that lesson learned. It's not the starting point, it's the end point of it. Then I think there's a question of, what is the lesson learned vis-a-vis the rest of the world, yeah? I mean, the sort of hated global south word that we, for lack of a better term, we keep on referring to it. And there I think it's actually almost exactly the opposite. There I think there should be far less ideas and ideology and attempted persuasion going around, and a great deal more pragmatism.
Thank you. So my conclusion would be very short. I feel we are all in the race to build this better, I wouldn't say new, security architecture for all of us. But we are very varied in our opinions, whether we are going to win this race, whether we are running quickly enough. And I believe this is very healthy that we are having this debate while we are racing in the same direction. Thank you all.
Thank you.
So please, let's come over there.
Thank you for a panel. It was the closure panel of the whole conference, and I have to say that it was just exactly what I wanted it to be. It is just looking into the future, having lessons learned from the past, and to my really great pleasure, somewhat optimistic. Thank you for that. Dear President, dear ministers, dear ambassadors, dear participants, and first and foremost, dear friends, it is time to finish this conference and to say the final words. It has been 3 days, and I think that, and I hope for, that it is offered everybody something, either new ideas, either new friends, either something to think about. What we can see here is that for a second year in a row, Ukraine is in the center of our attention. I personally dream of a day when Ukraine will be boring European country, nothing to speak about, but it seems that it is still far away. The topic of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine is a painful topic, and we need to remember that every day when we speak about it, there are people who lose their lives. But it has also initiated many processes and made visible hidden undercurrents. And it is the conference has also dealt with these undercurrents and these new processes. If we speak about the role of US, what has much discussed here during the conference, on one hand, we can see as Fiona Hill put it, that some kind of America fatigue can be felt in global sense, and many controversial opinions rise. But on the other hand, it is also very clear that there is necessity for America for to think about themselves and to introspection inside their society, so that we can better understand who they are. In Europe, it is. I was really happy that there was many allusions to the title of a conference, Incipit Vita Nova. In Europe, it is somehow we can still feel that even if there is much pain, even if we are on different pages often, there is some kind of new breath and new energy what can be felt. And it is like also the well forgotten, but the basis what has always been there. And it is the basis of morality and values. And in this context, I would like to say another quote of Dante. I really liked it, but I couldn't find the proper panel where to put it. And anyway, it was too long. But the quote says, "The darkest places in hell are reserved for those who maintain their neutrality in times of moral crisis." And I would like to I would like to really believe that we live up to it and do not reserve ourselves the darkest places. I'm happy for Timothy Garton-Ash, who unwaveringly feels optimism about Europe, and even in places where Brexit has happened, he just like keeps saying that bon courage. So it is one of the aims of this conference was to have a broader look. And it is also, as Fiona said, that we do not even have the right term. She called it the rest. We said it's global south. As Dr. Juma just mentioned, it's lazy thinking. I do agree. But I do think that it is still the positive move to have this dialogue here on neutral spot of land in Estonia, and we really need to find the best model how to proceed. And I personally, as also it was the Global South panel here, it was kind of, we saw that there can be the way forward, what we can share. Lennart Meri has told that politics is a factory producing the future. And in this factory, we all have our smaller or greater jobs to do. We all have our roles, rights, and also obligations. And so Lennart Meri Conference has tried to give its little contribution to working out these policies, to enhance the discussion, to mitigate hostilities, and to really pave the way for better tomorrow. And it is my last conference. And organizing this event for 5 years, I know it sounds like a trafferet. In my case, I mean it, that it has been a huge privilege. And I'm honored and humbled that I had this possibility. I also want to thank Lennart Meri family for trusting me just to give the legacy and just to work with Lennart Meri's legacy. I do hope that it has been sufficiently done. Thanks. It is collective effort. It's not me. It is just that I have had the best team that I can imagine of. But I want to thank the institution with whom I have worked throughout the year. And if I say institution, it doesn't mean that I work with institutions, I work with people. And behind every institution, there are my personal friends, my personal colleagues, the contacts, who has always been very supportive, either producing the ideas, either trying to find the best way to find the best way for different kinds of problems. So I want to thank my home, ICDS, also President's Office, Government Office, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Prime Minister Office, Minister of Defense, General Staff, and many others who have been involved to this. I want to thank sponsors and partners without whom it has been absolutely impossible, and who has been also for years my good friends. I want to thank the hotel here, whose commitment and flexibility has been just amazing. It is the team under the leadership of Vitaly and Anastasia and Rina, also the chef whose delicious food I think that you have all managed to enjoy. René, I really thank you for making this hotel home for Lennart Meri Conference. I want to thank RGB, our technical partner, under the leadership of Ivar. It's in impeccable work, and whatever there was the questions, they were just, the solutions made were the best ones. And then I want to thank the photographers, makeup maker Pierre, who just, thanks to whom I do not look like who I really am, total wreck. So, and I really thank my closest team, Maret and Pia, Merili and Liisi, Mart, Tõnis, Tony, Andres, Kersti, Tatjana, Piret, and the whole volunteers. I think that it is the place where we should now applaud, because it has been impeccable. I also thank Kadri and Riina, whom most of you knows here. My predecessors on the post of Lennart Meri, directors of Lennart Meri Conference. But it is not only that. I mean that if they would not have approved my wish to take this post, I would have not. It was only while they said me that they promised to help me, I dared to take it. And their unwavering support has been of primary importance for me. So I just want to thank them for advice, warnings, and good ideas. And last but absolutely not least, I want to thank speakers, moderators, participants here, because actually it is you who make this conference, and it is thanks to you that it exists. And it was, maybe I was a bit egoist, but for this year, I invited here the people I wanted to see the most. So it has been really my pleasure. All those who accepted the invitation, I really, really wanted to be you there. I want to introduce the new director of Lennart Meri Conference, who will be in charge. And her name is Minna-Lina Lind. She's here. And I think that it is not event what she's taken over, it's a lifestyle. This year's Lennart Meri Conference, the titles, as you might see, were taken from literary. It was on literary note. It was quotes from literature, and it is. I think that it is only right to also finish on literary note. It is from Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to Galaxy. I want to say you that's so long, and thanks for all the fish.
Thank you.